Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I hope wherever you are all well and safe. Thank you for joining us today. We are back at LA Louver. My name is Elizabeth East. I'm pleased to welcome you to the gallery and to introduce today our very special guest, Rebecca Campbell. I am delighted and just a little bit amazed to say that I have worked with Rebecca for almost 20 years. I first met Rebecca at the time of her thesis show at UCLA. The gallery started to represent her shortly thereafter, and we had her first show at LA Louver in 2002. Our current show, Infinite Density, Infinite Light, is our sixth, and it has been several years in the making. So it has been long anticipated. The show will be on view through July 2nd. In preparation for today, Rebecca recently joined me at the gallery to walk through her exhibition and to share her thoughts about it. We filmed the tour for technical reasons. It was much easier than doing a live tour today, and we are happy to premiere this tour right now. It will last about 25 minutes, following which Rebecca will join me in the context of the exhibition, and we will have a conversation about her show, and of course you will have the opportunity to ask your questions. So as you all know, after a year and a half, please add your questions to the Q&A. We will be responding to them during the course of it, I hope, and we will get to the questions after the fact if we can't do it live. We are also, as you probably noticed, recording this event, and we will post it on our website afterwards. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand matters over to a recorded Rebecca and to begin the tour. Thank you all very much for joining us, and see you soon.
Hi, welcome to LA Louver. My show, Infinite Density, Infinite Light, opened on May 24th, and I'm happy to show you some of what's inside. I wanted to start here because this sculpture represents the beginning of the kind of journey of this work. It started right after the 2016 presidential election. Like many people, I was confused and overwhelmed at that time and wanted to try and make sense of things in my studio. One of the primary things I was thinking about was, how did we get here? Why are we in this place right now? And what I often do with my work, instead of going out into the world to find answers, is to look into my own personal history or family history to try and sort through if there's some kind of allegory there that will make sense of things. So the first thing I focused on was a letter that my father sent me when he was actually about the age I am now, and I was 19 years old. And I had just moved in with my boyfriend at the time, a man who later became my husband and the father of my 3 kids. And the letter is 4 pages, and on each page of this letter, he tells me he loves me. And on each page of the letter, he tells me in some way how I've disappointed him. And on the last page of the letter, he tells me I'm a leftover. And it was because of his ideas formed largely by the extremely patriarchal culture that he was immersed in and that we were all immersed in. And what I saw in this document, this family document, was this perfect example of how a person can contain both love and yet still not necessarily treat the object of their affection with actions that reflect that love. So to me, this was a good example of how the world ended up where it was. I don't think that the animosity, the racism, the sexism that was really reflected in Trump's presidency came from a kind of cartoonish villain. I think it came from people who are confused and showing love in a way that is broken. So one of the things I was interested in diving further into is how narratives happen, how they come out of our personal history, how cultural narratives happen, how information can be revealed or oppressed or occluded. During the time period I was making this sculpture, the phenomena of fake news or alternate truths came out. And I started to think about the personal version of that, which is when a family story doesn't get told, or a family story is told over and over and over again, and it becomes a bigger part of the family history. So I wanted to make a formal presentation of this idea, and I started to have family documents printed on silk. And you see them behind me here. They range about 100 years in terms of when the documents were produced, and they range widely in terms of their kind of content and importance. So you see here on the left, this is one of my personal documents, which is a ticket stub from a Who concert I went to when I was like 18 years old. And then behind me is a Valentine that was sent via Western Union to my grandmother from my grandfather. And here is a baptism certificate of my grandmother. And all of these documents are meant to be transparent to some extent, and the configuration of this sculpture is not set. It is meant to be moved at times, so some documents come forward and other documents recede, either revealing themselves or hiding themselves. Another component of this particular sculpture is that the light is programmed to shift. And my intention there was to reference the non-linear nature of time and how we assume that one story precedes or comes after another story in families. And yet, the bigger truth to me is that stories are always being told, even of people who are past. Their story is changing and morphing and moving forward in time according to the context around that. So the lighting, you might have just seen it shift here. It rises in the east with a warm temperature and moves like the sun across the sculpture and sets in the west. And then the moon rises and the cool light begins rising in the east and setting in the west. And the idea is this nature of time and how time is more of a soup that we all live in as opposed to an arrow we travel on. So I begin this journey sort of diving back into family history and personal history, but in my practice, those initial impulses always sort of ripple out into other inquiry. So personal history, art history, political history, ecological history. And in this painting, it's sort of an amalgam of a few of those. And it's based on a photograph of my oldest sister and her husband at the time from their marriage. And I was trying to figure out these cross impulses. I was trying to figure out how we live in a world that is, for one thing, so confusing, but also so conflicted. So in terms of the letter from my dad, he loved me. I have absolutely no doubt that my dad loved me. In fact, in that letter, he tells me that I'm more like him than any of his other children. And the next sentence he says, "But you are a girl, so things are different for you." So I see even within him his own confusion and doubt at these conflicting ideas. And so in this particular painting, I wanted to explore that same sort of love-hate relationship that I have with the history of art. So a quick, funny little story. In my senior year of undergrad, I had this wonderful teacher, Manuel Esquerdo, who was a sculpture teacher, who taught me to weld, he taught me to wood carve. He was a big influence in my life. But Manuel, at some point, he loved me so much, and he pulled me aside to give me pearls of wisdom all the time. And one of these times, he pulled me aside, and he said, "Rebecca, you are too good to be looking at women artists." And it was a confusing moment because on the one hand, it was sort of an invitation to a party, right? I was now invited to the big leagues. He respected me as much as men. At the same time, I had to deny this whole other part of my existence to attend that party. And I started to think about this reality in a lot of women artists' life, in which their lineage in terms of where they came from, their artistic voice, their aesthetic ideas, their formal chops, come from this kind of patriarchal history. And yet that same history also has embedded in it a lot of anger or disdain or ignoring of the history of women. So this particular painting is based on this image of my brother-in-law, who was held up in my family as like, a rock star. He's the exact kind of husband you want. I have 5 sisters and 1 brother, and this guy was sort of like set the standard. He was handsome, he was charismatic, he was smart, he was hot. But he also turned out to be extremely problematic. He was narcissistic, he was self-involved. There were a lot of problems in terms of it was not a good marriage. And so I've conflated it here. Most people who are familiar with the history of art will see the reference here to de Kooning. And I went in, I can't remember the exact date, maybe 2002, there was a big de Kooning show in New York. And I hadn't had my official de Kooning moment as a painter. But I went to the show because I was in New York and I was hoping to have my de Kooning moment. So I went to the show, and it is one of the very, very few times I've cried in front of works of art. I was floored. The work was so transgressive and intensely beautiful and formally inventive, and just opened me up. I was so blown away. And again, at the same time, it was impossible for me as a woman to stand in front of the women's series, where the images of these icons, Marilyn, other women, are reduced to eyeballs and boobs and mouths, sort of gnashing teeth, and not see the anger or the conflict, or it's all mixed up with passion and adoration as well. But it is impossible to see that work without also, as a woman, feeling somewhat attacked. So I made this painting trying to explain that phenomena, this attraction-repulsion, this being in a history that has brought me up, that raised me, that nurtured me, that gave me all its treasures, and that also backhanded me the entire way there. One thing that is integral to the way the exhibition resolved in the end was how world events shifted over the course of the last year and a half. Beginning with Australia being on fire, and a number of other events, of course, including the pandemic, and importantly, the murder of George Floyd. I was working in the studio on this painting, and in my mind, it's an image of my oldest sister again from her college dorm and her dorm mates. And I was really interested in the concept of this mountain, this huge pile of girls laying on each other and sort of pretending to be asleep, but clearly not asleep, sort of this performance of being asleep. And I thought it was fascinating, and I thought that formally the way they were knit together and leaning on each other or being squashed or being held up was a wonderful metaphor for the way women are with each other and all the ways of being. And I thought this painting would be primarily about feminism and how women hold each other up or cling to one another or push each other down. And I was working on that, just filling in the space of the painting, and George Floyd was murdered. And what I realized during that time, it became painfully obvious to me, it should have been obvious before this point, but it wasn't, that all the girls were white, except for in the very bottom corner, there's one Native American girl. And I stopped work on the painting. And I realized that the painting was about something entirely different. And I wanted to be respectful and inclusive of this story. So I started to do some research, and I started to think about how, for one thing, the land that this particular college was on was a native land. And I thought it belonged primarily to the Shoshone Indian tribe. And there's another sort of very complicated history that involves a lot of racist assumptions, with the Navajo people of the area being taken away from the reservation and put into white homes for an education. So these two things started to come to the fore, and I did research to try and figure out what was the history of the land, what was the potential history of this individual. And I ended up painting underneath what you see here a number of formal explorations that I thought might reveal my thinking. So on the one hand, under the painting you see now of the girl, there was a very dominant Navajo pattern on her dress, and behind the grays of the ceiling that you see now, there was a Shoshone print. And in the end, I wanted to explore how patterns tell stories or don't tell stories. And I think I found who she is through some research that I did. But I had made a lot of assumptions myself about what her feelings would be about this experience. And in the end, she wasn't sure it was her, because it looks exactly like her, but she's old enough now that her memory is failing her, and she didn't remember being at this event. And I had the realization at that moment that her story and her patterns are not mine to tell, that I couldn't really own this painting and own this narrative of critique of that place and that time and those people. So in the meantime, I started to paint white on, you see, a number of the dresses that the girls were wearing, because I was going to, on top of that, paint a daisy pattern from the 1960s that I felt was more about gender assumptions and responsibilities of that time period. So I was really just house painting. There's a part in these big painting processes where you're just filling in space. You're moving through one phase to a next phase. So I was using a very big brush, and I was putting a lot of white paint on the surface. And the idea was that I would then go back and render these into fabric. And at that moment, I stood back and looked at what had come from this kind of gestural painting, and I realized that was the painting. The pigment I was using at the time, which I always use, it's a Gamblin product called Radiant White. And the name of the painting is Radiant White. And what I found, and what I'm absolutely always hoping for in a painting, is that the formal qualities will be as important to the narrative and conceptual ideas as anything, as the pictures. And in this case, I think that happened, because you see this mountain of girls, and many of them are drowning in this white fabric. And it is both beautiful, and it has this punch and freshness, but it also is aggressive, and it takes over the space. So I realized that this painting was not really about feminism, it was about white feminism. And I don't fully understand what that means, but I'm trying to understand, and I'm trying to look at my own experiences and my own context and history, and to be more conscious about that element in my life and my work. As I mentioned before, the series of world events largely influenced this work. So after the murder of George Floyd, and I finished the painting Radiant White, a number of things happened. The pandemic continued, and I actually endured a kind of health scare. My appendix burst twice, and it was a very dangerous time for me. And unfortunately, a lot of big life epiphanies come at these perilous times. And so at that moment, when I returned home and I started to try and get myself back into the studio, I realized that the work was shifting. And I felt that the kind of intense criticality of the work that had come before it was very useful at that moment, but at the new moment, I needed to meet myself with some other kind of work. And I have 3 kids, and they were enduring with the rest of the world everything you all remember: the pandemic, the environmental, the fires, and they were anxious, extremely anxious. And I was extremely anxious. And I felt like to get back into the studio, I needed to find a place in myself of hope and balance. And I wasn't looking for any kind of saccharine happy ending. I was looking for a place of meaning and being able to look forward. So I revisited a series of photographs I took right before the pandemic started, a couple of months before. And it was from a trip that I had taken to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, which is a very wild and beautiful place. And the images were particularly striking to me. The protagonists, the figures in these pictures were children. And it seemed to me that in some ways we were all those children right now, sort of wandering through the wildness, figuring out how to be and what to do and where to go. And so the forest itself, to me, is a wonderful metaphor for something that is both spectacularly beautiful, but also dangerous and overwhelming. But it also has qualities of being nest-like, of being nurturing, of being encouraging. And so I returned to these images thinking first about just moving forward in the studio, but also I was interested in all of these images pointing forward in time, that again, there was a sense of what was yet to come, what we might make, where we might go. And so I started to make these paintings of my kids in wild places. And there's still hints of references to history and art history. In particular, in this painting, you'll see my son is wearing, he just happened to be wearing that Robert, Indiana sort of love logo t-shirt. But it seemed to me a moment to return to that. Also, strangely, his middle name is Love because my grandmother's maiden name is Love. And in a strange way, it seemed the most dangerous thing I could paint at that moment. I was worried it would be taken as something trivial or simplistic or saccharine in nature, but the impulse was something much deeper, to be able to make a direct reference to a kind of way of looking at the world, whether it be what we're lacking, what we truly are, but it seemed a symbol that was dangerous to paint and absolutely necessary to paint. This painting works for me in sort of a quintessential way in terms of thinking about my practice. It starts as a personal narrative, and that narrative is about my daughter, who was born very sick and spent 4.5 months in the NICU. It was very difficult for her to learn how to breathe, how to eat, how to do many things. And it turns out she's perfect. I'm totally unbiased in that opinion. But she is the strongest individual I know, the most brave, the most powerful, and she's 9. And so I made this image in the middle of what seemed to be a world falling apart. There was a coup on the Capitol. There were, it seemed to be a moment of extreme vulnerability for our family, for the country, for the world. And so I returned to this image to sort of remember that the forces around us are important, but that the forces within us match them. And this became a very important image to me for that reason.
Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for being so generous with all of your thoughts and taking us through some of the key works in the exhibition. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to just step aside and just say thank you to all my colleagues, and especially for putting together that film and for the tech today, Alexander, Ashley, and Lisa, who are working behind the scenes. I am in the white void here. Rebecca is in the middle of her exhibition. And I'd like, Rebecca, if I may, and using the painting behind you maybe as a sort of springboard for our conversation, I noticed that as you were taking us through some of these key paintings, that the figure actually became less dominant, or certainly in terms of scale, became a sort of a smaller aspect of your composition. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and the trajectory of that.
Sure. I want to piggyback on that. Thank you, Elizabeth, and everyone for making this happen. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm always so grateful when people are interested in hearing about the work and seeing the work. You can see a figure right here behind me, I think, and there's some more right over there. I think the scale of the figure, I'm always fascinated with the way painting is able to fuse form and content, form and conceptual ideas. So in some of the paintings, the figures are very large, and in these paintings near the end, they're quite small. And as I was just talking about in the film at the very end, the painting of the Andy, when the whole world was sort of just akimbo, craziness, and it seemed so big. And yet I remember a particular experience with, I love the forest and I love the wilderness, but I didn't grow up camping or anything like that. But when I met my husband, we went backpacking for our honeymoon, and we loved the forest. And we were sitting around a campfire at one point, and we had this different perspective on the stars. We were looking up the stars, and the stars were so huge when you're out in the wilderness and you can see them so clearly. And the effect of that can be to feel very small. And feeling small in some ways can make you feel out of control, like you are overwhelmed by the environment. But Todd said at that moment, this makes me feel so safe and so good, because I feel like I'm just part of a bigger whole. And so I had this kind of amazing shift of perspective about the bigness and wildness of things. So in this particular painting, that was the idea of this fabric of the environment in which the people don't necessarily dominate or control the conversation. They're a part, and they're an important part, but they're just that, just a part.
And going back to some of those earlier pieces in the course of your conversation, there are quite a few members of your family as well that feature in the work. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how they have played a role in your paintings.
Sure. I mean, autobiography really goes in and out of favor in the art world as being, you know, in all different kinds of forms. In poetry, you look at someone like Sylvia Plath, who a lot of people really have a lot of disdain for, because they think her work is too autobiographical and that makes it simplistic. But for me, I mean, the first thing an artist has to do is figure out they need to make things and you have to want to make things. And for better or worse, for me, it's always been a helpful tool for figuring out, for processing information and experiences. And my experiences have been with the people around me. So I turn to them, I turn to the images, the ideas, the places, the people, to revisit important stories and important people. But it usually is sort of a door, you know, that I open and walk through. So hopefully, I mean, because how abysmally boring if it was just about my family stories. But, you know, I happen to have this I think everyone has an amazing story. I don't really even think it matters that it's my story. I think I have never known a person deeply or considerably without finding out something amazing about their history. So for me, it's sort of like, you know, people get inspired by different things, maybe where they live or the light. You know, people talk a lot about Hockney moving to LA and it changing the palette and how light can affect people. And for me, that source is often the family.
I'd also like to talk a little bit about the installation of the exhibition, because when we started out talking about this show, at least I talked about like two bodies of work, as if they were sort of separate bodies of work. There was a sort of the early body of work that referenced things that had happened to you in your past, and then there was a sort of the newer body of work that was more oriented towards what's been happening over the last year and a half and with your family and your children. And when we came to do the installation, we tried out sort of, first of all, separating them into a sort of chronological, like, well, here's one body, here's another body. And then actually when my colleague Peter came in as well, there was this sort of this revelation that in effect, the sculpture that you talked about, which is the sort of conceptual underpinning of the show and this idea of time being nonlinear, kind of helped to direct the installation and actually mix the works up. So in effect, that it's a nonlinear presentation, and that it was meant to be a sort of, in effect, the exhibition is an experience, and you traverse, as you go around the exhibition, you are seeing representations of things that happened somewhat recently, and then from many decades ago.
Sure. I mean, I think that I didn't plan that. And that's, for me, is such an important, amazing, transformative thing about art. For me, I don't want to be in control from beginning to end, and I'm kind of a control freak. I like the idea of planning and moving towards something, but then it's this alive experience when you're making work. And even so, you have the painting itself and you have a plan for the painting, but for me, the painting never turns out exactly as I had conceived it, which is being relieved of my control at some point, or my prediction for it, I think, is what always helps it rise to another level. And that happened happily with the exhibition as well, because in my mind, and we worked on the little model, and I had this idea that the work should be separate and that they would work sort of as these two characters talking to each other. But instead, what happened in the film, I talk about how family stories continue to evolve. Maybe details emerge or recede, or the context of the world changes the way we think about a family story. And so essentially that story is changing. It's not the same story it was. And that became mirrored in the actual exhibition, because there was this idea for what the work would be. And then it came to the gallery and it continued to grow. I mean, and that is so exciting, that once it leaves the studio, it has another life, and it moves on, and hopefully it goes into other environments. And you get, when a piece is curated into a different show, then you have the voice of the curator and their vision and their context and their narrative that they weave around it. And for me, some people really want to control all that, but I have that impulse. But then, for instance, when a painting falls apart, which they do sometimes, they fall out of your control, and you have to somehow have this epic battle with them. And the way through the battle is always to be open to new endings. And for me, I guess maybe I'm hard-headed, but I have to learn that again and again and again, because after it happens, I'm grateful, but I'm resistant the whole way there.
Yes, I really liked the way you talked about Radiant White and how the painting kind of told you what to do, that you went through this kind of whole process of adding lots of color and textiles and all sorts of other devices, and then suddenly it became a completely different painting. And how often does that happen in your work, where the paintings actually say, Rebecca, this is not what you planned?
I would say 100% of the time. I mean, for the paintings that I actually like, because in the end, there is, and for me, I know other media can also have this relationship, but there's something about painting. Painting requires the brain and the body. So my process is that I come up with an idea, and I often come up, old fashioned, they're like albums. I think of many paintings together or sculptures as a kind of suite of ideas. And I hold that in my head, but that thing has to, because I'm not a person, I'm not post-studio, I am a studio artist. So that conceptual premise always gets thrown through my body. And my body has its own intelligence that is separate from this kind of abstract space of ideas. And so the hands, the gut, the breath, all has its say in the work. And it becomes better that way. And it's difficult, it's weird, wobbly space to live in, but painting is uniquely suited to that beautiful experience, which to me seems so quintessentially human, that we have to hold these two impulses of the brain and the body, and that not only should we hold them, we celebrate them, as complicated as they are.
This leads me to actually raise one of the questions that an attendee has asked. This actually comes from Matt Wadle, who says, how has pain affected your understanding of form?
Pain, P-A-I-N?
P-A-I-N.
Well, that's a complicated question, Matt. I like that question. I mean, pain is suffering is life, right? I mean, that's the Buddhist tenet. I would say that okay, this is my answer to that. People come to art in many different ways. I ran to it out of desperation to save my life. And so pain is the foundation for everything I make.
Wow. I'm going to pivot a little bit now and go back to your tour and to acknowledge the fact that you mentioned photography several times when you were talking about your work. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about really the role that it plays, the basis for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. It's a big part of this work. And I'm interested, if you look at the sculpture that was sort of the beginning nexus of this work, it is layered and it has all of these elements. You look through things to other things, and frames, one frame leads through to another frame. And I started to think about how the technology, how context forms meaning. And so I was thinking about just different kinds of technology, photography, painting. And if you think about how photography has shifted obviously over time, and so you'll see in a lot of these images, if you could actually bring up the image of the painting Trebin, I can talk more specifically about it. So in this painting, what you see, or what I see, is, for one thing, importantly, that the figure, the highlights of the figure are completely blown out. Because from what I remember of photography in the 80s, you were sort of either, you know, shifting the light toward the shadows or toward the highlights. And in this case, you see on the very right-hand side of the painting, you know, the aperture is set to give you the nice nuanced lines of those level or blinds. But the trade-off of that is that a lot of the highlights are blown out. So that aesthetic, that color, that way of recording an image becomes a kind of aesthetic interpreter of meaning and experience. The other thing, so there's the photograph itself, which was taken in the 80s of my first boyfriend. But then on top of that, I'm looking back at it. So the original looker in this painting is 16-year-old Rebecca, who's looking at this boy who's looking at her. And there's this kind of gaze, this seductive interaction between the two. But I was then looking back at this as a 50-year-old woman from a very different time in history. So if you see, a lot of the marks that are in the painting are Photoshop marks. And a lot of people who use Photoshop, I'm a kind of a barbarian as far as using it. I don't really know how to use it well, but I know the basic tools. So you see a basic eraser tool mark and a cut and paste, and the way things are offset or left and not fully erased. So the idea is to record not only the effect of the time the event took place in, but at the times that the event has been revisited again and again and again, and how that looking again carved literally formally into the narrative, but also figuratively and allegorically carves and reshapes what we know about that set of information.
Wonderful. One of the questions actually ties in a couple of things that we've been talking about, and that's returning to this idea of using family as subjects. And a question has been posed: do you actually pose your models? Do you paint from or do you use existing photographs and compose on the canvas? And then there's a follow-up question to that as well, which is like, how do they feel about it? So if you would like to.
Well, the first one is an easier question to answer, which is both. I do both, and it depends on what I'm painting. So a lot of the images are found images. One of the particular things about my family history and the culture I grew up in is they are genealogists. So they save family history artifacts like crazy. So photographs and documents and stories and who lived where, when. So I have a lot of information to draw from that way, which is great. And then some of them, like some of the photographs of the children were manipulated by me in terms of like I tried the one of Angus, which is still waters, in several locations, and I knew I wanted this image of a half immersed figure. So I control it to a certain extent, but I never know, just like the paintings themselves, if I'm going to use that image. Sometimes I use an outtake from the image. Sometimes I find an image, and almost in the images that I take myself, they're never a single photography source. They're usually several images that have been pushed together in some way, which is why they have that kind of weird and uncanny kind of space. Something feels liminal or off. Or, so anyway, that's one reason. How they feel about it, I think it probably runs the spectrum. I can say that my father, who of course inspired the first letter piece, I mean, I've been making work about my father since I was 16 years old, but I know he's passed, and I know he was extraordinarily proud of me. And I know I almost drove him completely crazy because we disagreed on so many things. And it's difficult when someone in your family is doing something like I'm doing. So I imagine, you know, sometime I know that, you know, I made a piece in this show about my sister, Allison, who is just older than me. I'm the youngest. She's the second youngest. And we don't talk that often. And it was an opportunity to talk to her, and we reconnected in quite a beautiful way. She was very happy about the painting. But I know there have been times in the past where members of my family have intentionally refused to participate and have asked to, you know. So anyway, I think it depends on the person. I have a big enough family that the range is there.
And which is the painting that Allison is?
Bricks and Balloons.
Bricks and Balloons.
And I made this, I was going to mention one of the reasons I was able to reach out to her is I made a little short film talking about that. And I also have been doing a lot of writing. So in one way, I think this is an interesting thing to talk about. So you see this breadth in my work between figuration and abstraction, which from the very beginning of my interest in art, people love categories. They just love categories, and they want to put you as a figurative painter or an abstract painter or a conceptual artist or formal artist. And I'm just not interested in those categories at all. So for me, I want to do what sounds interesting to me. And for me, I want it all. I want to be able to take that entire, have my choices be open. So the other thing is I also have been writing and doing all kinds of stuff. And so some of the writing is hopefully going to be in a book soon. And I also use the writing to overlay as these kind of narratives over the top of process photographs of the painting, showing how the painting was made. But I made this one of Bricks and Balloons, and it was a story about my sister, and it was nice. It was really nice to be able to give that to her and revisit that time. And again, my relationship, I mean, I think she would agree with this, has been very like this with that sister. And if you would have talked to me 10 years ago, I would have said our story was one thing, which may have been a very hard thing. And now it's a different thing. And, you know, it changes.
Yeah, when I was interrupting you just a moment ago, I was actually going to jump in and mention these to everybody out there. If you don't follow Rebecca Campbell on Instagram, please do. It's Rebecca Campbell Art Czar. That's CZAR. There is a series of amazing films that Rebecca has put together, which encompasses her writing, photographs about how paintings are developed, which I think is very, very generous. So you can actually see the various stages at which certain paintings go. They're very poetic. There's a lot of family, old family photographs in there. And I think you've done that for several of them. I know the No Cure, No Pain, the Evel Knievel one is amazing.
Yeah.
Vanta Envy as well, which takes off an interview that you, or a talk that you gave. So I do encourage everyone to look at that, because it's really very, very insightful. And that leads actually to me asking about technique, because one of the notable things which I encourage everyone to come in and see these paintings is that when you see them in person, you see this extraordinary range of the way in which the paint is being handled. So sometimes it feels like there's lots of glazes, sometimes it's slabbed on. There's scoring, there's almost an impression of embroidery or tapestry work, but there's just the sheer materiality of the work is really fantastic. And I wondered if you could talk about choices, that you make when you're approaching a painting, and whether that happens during the course, or whether again you go into it thinking how you are going to actually handle the paint.
Well, I have a trail that I start on usually, that I'm moving toward. But one thing that comes up when you say that, so I grew up on this side of a mountain, basically the foothills of a mountain, and there was a stream in the backyard. And I really consider one of my first performances, art performances or artistic experiences in that vein, to be laying in the stream and experiencing this physical sensation that was painful and exhilarating, and just sort of having this transformative moment. And it was, I guess you would put that in the formal category of things, because it's really about sensation, and it's about the physicality of the world, and about this kind of interaction with space. And at the same time, that environment that I grew up in was intellectually very repressive. And so the conceptual stuff was discouraged, but it was very rich physical life. The air, the smell, the weather, the food, the bodies, all of that was rich and deeply important to my practice. And then I moved away and I went to Portland, and then I ended up in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles at UCLA, the conceptual component of art was really lauded. And the physical part was not as important, at least with the people that I seem to be studying with. They were less focused on technique, for instance, or other even formal, well, I don't want to generalize, but in general, the conceptual framework of an artwork became incredibly important, which I had to fight tooth and nail for that through my teenage years. So having that nurtured and embraced was also important. So for me, these things, the picture and the way the picture is made, these are not either or situations. This is and. Both of these things to me help to explain the story in a way. So for instance, there's a painting in the show called Vanta Envy. And in Vanta Envy, she's wearing a plaid dress. And for a long time, for most of the time, I actually thought I finished the painting, and the plaid was painted in this kind of, it was pictorial. It was very realistic, and I liked it, but I just kept looking at it and thinking, it's not saying what it needs to say. There was something in the actual way the paint was. So at the very end of that painting, I risked ruining the entire thing. Plaid is extraordinarily difficult and complicated to paint. So once you've got it, you kind of don't want to mess with it. But I broke the entire painting open again with a lot of these kind of very gestural marks that in the end told the story more complexly and more completely, because it was a story about fabric, about a homemade dress, about plaid, about the 70s, the late 70s. And so this kind of, the picture, the photograph couldn't capture all that information. So you see that often in the work that, and it's a weird kind of space that you have to enter into. It's almost like it is like a trance. That sounds really cheesy, but it's kind of true, that the physical stuff requires a different temperament and a different consciousness when you're doing it in the studio, in that you're listening with your body and you're responding in a different way. And so you'll see a lot of different kinds of ways of making marks. And that's me responding in a kind of poetic, abstract space to content. Did that make sense?
Yeah, yes. And you mentioned risk in actually making the work. And then one of the questions that we have talking about risk is the fact that your subject, basically that one of love, you talk about love, the question is that given all the hate crimes that predominate in the world, in the media, and just the general toxic environment that we're in, do you see the act of love or the portrayal of love as transgressive?
100%. And I would say first with myself, not like the world is doing this, but I wrote a piece about this. And I wrote an essay essentially talking about how when I was a kid, when I was a girl, I was trying to escape this extremely kind of oppressive patriarchal, they were telling me not to go to school and, I needed to escape. So I felt like I would be able to escape if I didn't learn to cook, didn't learn to sew, didn't have babies. I thought if I did those things, I might be able to escape. I also had all these weird little rules for myself. I wouldn't use the word cute or nice or love because these were associated with, for one thing, they effeminized everything and they were seen as trivial and unimportant. I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but I'm very interested in how ideas like nostalgia or love or comfort are very transgressive in the art world, and how those are gendered things, that throwing those out of a serious conversation is to lose so much of the conversation. And so for me, when I talk about love, I mean, love is one of the most complicated ideas you could ever try and dance around. So I don't mean love like, let's just, it's not a Coca-Cola ad, but it is, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. I mean, you can try and talk about these subjects and fail, and mostly we do. But I felt like for me, I gave myself permission to cook. I gave myself permission to have children. And this idea of love to me seems dangerous in that it's pretty radical to love. It's radical, first of all, to love yourself. It's the hardest place to start with that. And yet it transforms everything. You talk about paradigm shifts. If you go there, the world is anew, it is. So yes, I think it is a radical act. And I think that there's a big discussion in so many things that have been set as taboo that are not always directly confronted as chauvinism, or as some kind of silencing of a particular voice because it skirts too close to, I don't know, the mother, or, we could talk about young men a lot of.
Going on another question, they're coming thick and fast now, so
great.
I'm going to go on a little bit,
Sure.
if everyone is staying with us. This one is actually from Luann McKinnon, who says to you, Rebecca, I've always struck by your virtuosity with paint, and I can see it in your writing as well. Can you comment on the correlation?
Hi, Luann. Thank you for coming. I've written for a very long time. I mean, since I was in high school, as long as I've been painting, but I don't have the kind of training. So I've been very self-conscious about how that intersects with my art, because I have a particular pedigree with my visual art that I'm allowed to do whatever I want because I have a pedigree. And my poetry comes from a different place. But to me, they've been part and parcel. They're very important, and they tend to go sort of like seesaw. I move toward one and then I move toward the other. But if you look at my writing or read it, it's often very pictorial. It has a kind of concrete quality that I mean, this I could see this going into the abstract space, but if you think about the color periwinkle, everybody think about that. And then you say the word periwinkle, and it adds and detracts, and it is different. And again, it's like moving towards figuration or abstraction. For me, I just want all the tools. Give me all of the tools to try and explain this experience of being a human and thinking about ideas, trying to conceptualize infinity or black holes or whatever it is. And sometimes you come at an issue. Any of these things are approximations, or we move around ideas. And then sometimes you need to come at it from another angle, or re-explore it, redigest it in a different way. And for me, one of the beautiful things about writing is, for one thing, it's not toxic. And for another thing, it's not, it's radical, because you can rip it all apart so easily. Like when you're looking at a 14-foot long painting that you've just spent 3 months on, it takes an extraordinary amount of bravery to rip it apart and change it profoundly. But, you know, cut and paste on a Word doc, you can play all day long. So it's kind of, I think of it in some ways the way an artist might think about a sketch versus a final work, that you're able to play with ideas very fluidly, and you can say things you're not supposed to say, and then you can just delete them.
So the show's title, can you say, this is another question, can you say a little bit about that and how it relates to any specific painting, or if it's intended as sort of a umbrella?
Yeah. Infinite density, infinite light is, well, my oldest son, Angus, when he was like 10, he's very precocious. He was very interested in quantum physics, and I've always been interested in science in a lot of ways, so he was sort of piquing my interest more, and we were discussing ideas, and so anyway, I was watching a lot of documentaries and reading and stuff. And I remember someone saying at one point in their description of a black hole, that if you were to be inside a black hole, you would experience infinite density and infinite light. And it just immediately rung to me as true on every single level about the human experience. And I know it's kind of weighty and, you know, serious, but that's the way I think about things. And to me, it was able to capture, I love this idea of things becoming something else. So I won't talk too much about this, but there's a painting from my very first show at Louver called Hey 19. And it's a big, tall, 9-foot tall painting of a boy. And all you see of the figure of the girl is sort of her hands peeking around his waist and her fingers slipping in his pocket. And I wanted to make an enormous painting of an enormous man that was a painting about the girl. And I thought that that was an interesting way to be able to do it, that the painting was being controlled by these two little fingers and not this dominant figure. And so in the same way, I love the idea of the black hole appearing as an absence of light, and yet somehow its internal qualities are infinite light. It takes all the light inside of it. And also the idea of holding opposites, which I think we're asked to do constantly as human beings. We are asked to experience mortality with an understanding of immortality conceptually as human beings. And this idea of holding opposites seemed especially perfect for this time and this show and where we're at right now.
Wonderful.
I think we're all in that place, it seems. Well, I shouldn't assume for other people. A lot of my people are in an infinitely dense, infinitely light place right now.
Right, absolutely. We do have quite a few more questions, but I should point at this time say that, I know that we're not going to get to all of them, so we will try and respond after the fact. But I wanted to, as time is kind of moving on here, I did want to just talk to you, Rebecca, about what you're doing right now in the studio, and what your plans are for the next year or so. And I know some of them, of course, but if you could share, that would be wonderful.
Well, sort of some of the stuff I'm doing is I'm writing a lot, and I'm making these little films, which are I feel so vulnerable about, because I have no training, but they're really fun. And the wonderful thing about the beginning of a body of work, so I feel like, I've finished this body of work. That's what I say. But the beginning phase of a body of work is so permissive and exciting, but also usually looks really bad, and it has all of these, it's very awkward phase, but I allow myself to do anything. So that's what I'm doing right now. Like, it doesn't make sense altogether necessarily. And the ideas I'm allowing, if you think about it like a hopper, the hopper is just open. So I'm allowing everything to just tumble in. During the next year, I'm hoping to get a book out, and that would include writing and images of new work. And in the fall, I'm excited to have a show opening in Sun Valley, Idaho, which my parents are both from Idaho, and I'm excited to have a show opening there in the fall. It's a beautiful place near the Sawtooth Mountains, which is where I went backpacking for my honeymoon. So I haven't been there for many years. I'm excited. And then in the winter, in January, there's a show opening at the Nora Eccles Museum in Logan, Utah, which I'm excited about, and will include some of the pieces from this show, and probably some new pieces as well, hopefully. And then in the spring, I have been working with Tyler at the Orange Coast College Doyle Arts Pavilion, and we have had a very complicated, interesting sort of experience putting this show together, because it was supposed to open a year ago at least, and had to be postponed several times because of the pandemic, and will happily probably include a lot of new work because of that, because I've had time to sort of make a lot of work. And that will open in the spring and be accompanied by, some other nice community involvement things. So a bunch of shows coming up, which is exciting, and new work, which it seems to all be like kind of coalescing at a good time, making work in the springtime, and California just opened up today, and we're gonna, I'm allowing myself I'm allowing myself to breathe in this moment, because we know something else is going to pile on soon. But it seems like I'm just embracing this exciting moment of growth and openness and regeneration.
It sounds like a wonderful, wonderful celebration, and a wonderful note to conclude on, and to say that, we are, we're looking forward to welcoming everyone who can come to Venice Beach to see the exhibition in person. We are maintaining an appointment system just to kind of keep things in check, but at the same time, it's really open. You will not have a problem. Go online, lalouver.com. We're open Monday through Friday, 10 to 6 every day. And we're, of course, at 45 North Venice with parking across the street. We make it really easy for you. The show will be on through July 2nd. We also have, when you come, you don't just get one exhibition, you get two, with Heather Gwen Martin upstairs, and a lot of wonderful things behind the scenes as well with all my colleagues. We are back in force and feeling very positive. And this is a wonderful show to really kind of understand sort of the physicality. And I can share with you that, people who have come have really enjoyed that and shared their love of the experience, which I think is very special indeed. So I say follow us on Instagram, follow Rebecca on Instagram. Please check out these wonderful little films that she has made, and I'm delighted to hear continuing to make. And for everyone out there, keep safe and keep well and enjoy art. And thank you, Rebecca, for being so generous.
Thank you for coming. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you out there, everyone, for coming.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.